Pancake everyone, dear friends. All of you probably know from your childhood such characters as Pac-Man and Mario, and we think that everyone has had electronics of one of these brands. Sony, Canon, or Nikon. And of course everyone knows the brands of cars Toyota and Nissan. What do all of these brands have in common? That's right, it all comes from Japan. Today we will talk about it. In the 80s of the last century, many people talked about Japan as an actively developing country, like its economy could catch up and even overtake the American economy. But what went wrong? We will talk about that today. And before we do that, we'd be happy if you like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of useful and entertaining videos ahead. For the last 30 years, Japan has been experiencing severe economic stagnation. Suddenly, for many countries and Japan itself, China is coming to the center of attention. In addition, Japan's demographic problem is becoming a big one. The nation is aging, and the number of young people is declining. Why has Japan passed on its primacy to China and not become the world leader? What are the country's prospects these days? At its peak, Japanese companies were one of the top 10 most expensive companies in the world. And what's happening now? Let's see. 8 out of 10 companies are American. Let's look at the country in 1989. It's a rich country that can afford to give citizens loans at the lowest interest rates and mortgages for as long as 100 years. Could you ever imagine such a thing? Japanese billionaires became famous by buying the most expensive goods for crazy amounts of money. For example, a Van Gogh painting or the world's most expensive diamond. They were able to afford it. Real estate prices were incredibly high and could go up to $1 million. And that's not all. That same year, Sony bought the American company Columbia Pictures. Let's find out why Japan came to the kind of standard of living we see now. 20 years prior, the country was actively taking over Western technology. Studying the technology of a major American company, Japan began to produce a new and useful material called nylon. Why is it so useful? They began to make various household items from it. And not only. In turn, the same American company is spending millions of dollars on its research. The Japanese company Toray is smarter. It buys a patent from DuPont and earns many times more by selling nylon around the world. Other Japanese corporations are doing the same thing. They bought about 15,000 patents from various large companies, mostly American, over the next 20 years. So by improving the technology, they make the manufacturing process cheaper, and their products became more attractive to society. And so Japan has cheap products that are spreading all over the world at a rapid speed, most of which are cheap appliances. One of the biggest corporations producing cheap appliances in Japan at the time was Panasonic. But at what point did things go wrong? Let's take a close look at the world situation. In the 70s, American cars, Ford, Chevrolet, Pontiac, etc. sold best in America. But after a while, Toyota and then other Japanese car makers took the lead. The same can be said about electronics. We can say that Japan of that time is the equivalent of China in the early 2000s. So Japan is taking the lead in sales of various mass consumption products, thereby eclipsing the brands of Europe and America. Western goods are beginning to lose out to Japanese competition. In American cities, unemployment appears as a problem. For decades, the US had been selling out its technology, and this is what it all led to. Finally, the Americans felt that it was no longer profitable for them, and in 1985, all trade relations with Japan were stopped. In September of 1985, countries such as the United States, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Japan agreed to align their currencies. What does this mean? Let's look at it clearly. The US is comfortable buying goods abroad because the dollar is expensive at the time. However, there is a conflict in that US goods are more difficult to sell. This situation leads to an imbalance, in which case the economy begins to suffer first. What is the solution? The first option is to lower the dollar. The second is to introduce high duties on Japanese goods to support local producers. As a result of discussions, the representatives of the countries decided to lower the dollar exchange rate. But things didn't quite go according to plan. Yes, it was convenient for the US that their goods have become more competitive in the market. At the same time, the exchange rate of the Japanese yen has soared so much that now nobody is willing to buy Japanese goods as before. It's an interesting fact that the Japanese didn't pay attention to that. whereas the rich Japanese started living the high life and buying the most expensive things. But ignoring the drastic appreciation of the yen will lead to severe consequences for Japan's economy 5 years later. Have you ever heard of zombie companies? If not, we will tell you now. After all, this is exactly the time when the economy in Japan fails and such companies appear. For example, some large retail chain. It employs several thousand people who need to feed their families, and such stores provide the population with basic necessities, so they play an important role in the economy of the country. Now let's imagine such a situation that such a company has a multi-million-dollar debt. Something has to be done about it, but what? Here's the solution the Japanese government came up with. They gave out cheap loans with low interest rates, thereby saving the stores, so that people keep working and the banks don't go out of business. These companies are called zombies because they exist on the verge of bankruptcy, and this leads to catastrophic consequences, as such companies in the country by the year 2000 become several tens of thousands. Why is it that now in 2023, Japan is still stagnating? After all, we still buy Sony and Canon cameras, and Japanese cars are also popular. We have a question for you. Can you remember if in the last decade there was a Japanese company that had a new idea and new technology? Something that had not been produced before. For example, in America, we can see a new invention every decade. This is Apple and Microsoft and Google and Amazon. Here we can also remember the largest Chinese companies, Alibaba and Tencent. And of all the major global companies, only one made the list, Toyota. This is why the last 30 years are called the lost time for Japan. What awaits Japan today? What's for certain is that this country boasts an average life expectancy of 85 years, but on the other hand, it is an aging nation. In fact, 1 in 3 people in the country is over 65 years old, and over the course of 40 years, there are only fewer children. So this could lead to young people working for old people's retirement. On top of that, Japan is facing such a problem as death from being overworked. There is even a term for such cases, karoshi. Imagine the average Japanese person overworking up to 100 hours a month and giving up vacation time. But is there another way in which Japan would not be economically collapsed? Here you have to look at modern-day China, which is now the second largest economy in the world. We talked about this in one of our past videos, but China started out the same way, with the production and sale of cheap goods. And then what did they do? They improved the technology and their goods became better than who they bought them from. This situation sounds familiar, doesn't it? But there is a difference. The collapse of Japan happened when the agreement was signed in 1985, which begs the question, could the Japanese have backed out of that agreement then and not signed it? Hardly. At the time, Japan was afraid of losing the US market. Had it not been for the agreement, the US could have raised tariffs significantly, and that certainly would not have done any good. And then we turn our attention to China. Nowadays, this country is constantly caught up in trade wars and has duties on most of its goods. That said, it can control its currency, and most likely they will be able to avoid the collapse and crisis that hit Japan in the 1980s. What do you think? Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell to be the first to see our new interesting videos. And that's all, thank you very much for watching. We wish you a good mood and a fair wind. See you soon. Pancake everyone.